Welcome back to the tutorials. So in the previous tutorial we started working on our cutscene here, and we've got it so that Bob will actually move down the screen. Right, immediately we take control away from the user and Bob moves down the screen. There is one thing that we want to fix right off the bat, and that has to do with our animation at the end here. You may have noticed it yourself, but you'll see that Bob will turn to the right, and then even though it worked out fine here, there are scenarios where by pausing the animation it pauses with Bob's eyes closed, and we don't want that. So let's go into our cutscene here, and instead of pausing the animation, let's copy this and let's change the animation to 0, which is just the idle Bob animation. Alright. Now, this is going to be a tedious tutorial, but bear with me because I think it's important for moving through a project and not getting too bogged down by mistakes and whatnot. And I made a lot of mistakes working through this part of the tutorial here, and I'm going to try to talk about some of those mistakes as briefly as possible, but here's where we're gonna start. There are multiple ways you can do a lot of programming. Okay, we could create, if we go to main and we go to load game, excuse me, we could create multiple string variables here and just load them up with the dialogue exchanges, right? And that might be one way to do it. Or we could hard code them here in each individual cutscene external event. Now I'm deciding to do it hard-coded in the external events only because we have individual timers we have to deal with in each of these two. So I'd rather just keep these contained in one external event and not have to worry about importing from variables other than just trigger variables. That's it. All right? Speaking of which, let's go to load game for a second, and I do want to add one more trigger variable here, or actually it's a data variable for keeping track. It's a global variable, and it's going to be called Jane and Henry dialogue count. And what this is going to do is this is going to keep track. We're going to make it 0. It's going to keep track of what the current dialogue is that we want to send to the screen. So let's go to our cutscene here, and let's add a new grouping, and we'll place it underneath here. I want it on equal plane as this one here, not underneath it, but equal. And we're going to call this one the dialogue exchange. And we're going to add a sub event underneath here. And we're going to say, we're going to use our variable that we just created and say when Jane and Henry dialogue count equals 1, not 0, 1. Then we're going to change, this is where we start using our dialogue manager variables, current string, things like that. We're going to set our current string, and that'll be a string of dmanager.current string. Here's where we're going to hard code our dialogue. I'm going to say Jane Waldorf is going to say, hey Bob, have you heard my darling son Henry sing yet? Okay, so we've got this now stored in current string, which means we can send, let me bring up our, where is it? Here it is, type on dialogue. We've got the current string, so we just need to trigger this event here, all of this, by changing check for dialogue equal to 1. So let's say variable value dmanager.check for dialogue, send it equal to 1. Okay, that should send it over to type on dialog and handle our sort of type on effect that we're using here. Now, you would think that this would be enough, right, to get things going. But you're going to run into a few problems here, actually, one of which has to do with this timer, which I'm not really sure why this is the case. We've got our timer paused here, or so we think, but I found that this timer actually continues to run even after I pause it. And that's because Jane and Henry.start is always equal to 1 while we're in this module of code, this whole thing here. So I spent a couple of hours trying to figure out why is this not pausing and staying paused and instead is resetting, and I came up with a couple of answers. One of which is this. When we start the kingdom at the top, we have Jane and Henry.complete is equal to 0, and that's just telling the user we have not gone through the opening cutscene yet. So go ahead and start it, right? And then we've got this reset timer right here, which initializes the timer. Now, because we never change Jane and Henry.complete to anything else, it's always equal to 0. It's always resetting the timer. So one thing that I did was I said, all right, let me, here in this code, let me go ahead and change Jane and Henry.complete. So Jane and Henry.complete, right? Let's change it equal to 1. We only need this to trigger one time anyway, right? So we could even put a trigger once here as well. Okay, great. So now it's equal to 1. It shouldn't be resetting itself, except it did constantly keep running anyway. So the next thing that I had to do was I had to change this to trigger once. And again, I'm not really sure why it didn't just pause the timer and stay paused, except again that Jane and Henry is always equal to 1 here at .start. So it must come down and it must actually reset the timer when it comes to this point here, and then when it comes here and says, okay, let's start the timer again, this is always true, right? At a certain point, Bob is always equal to Jane when he moves all the way down. So triggering it once helped a little bit here, right? But that wasn't the only thing. Then I had to come down here and I had to say, okay, maybe it's best to show you first. Let's do this. I've got to make, one of the last things we do here is we want to set dialog count from 0 equal to 1 to start the dialog exchange. So let's do that. Let's do Jane and Henry dot dialog count is now going to equal 1. And let me show you what happens here. Okay, right now it's not even popping up on the screen, and that's for a different reason. When you go to the kingdom here, we use dialog in a few spots. We use it in type on dialog, right? We use it here. But we also use it in kingdom collisions. In the bottom here, we've got this hide dialog, and it says when Bob is not in collision with signs, which he isn't during the cutscene, and when he's not in collision with townfolk, which he isn't in the cutscene, go ahead and run clear dialog timer. Well, if we go to clear dialog timer, the first thing it does is hide the dialog. So we've got to modify our kingdom collision code a little bit here and add the condition that says that basically we're not in the middle of a cutscene, which means changing the value of gmanager.cutscene start equal to 0, excuse me. 0 means we're not in a cutscene. Now, that should at least get our dialogue up on the screen here. Now here's the good news. All this work that we're doing is going to be repeatable in future games and even in this game itself. So you got to stick with it and code with the future in mind. Alright, see how it's just repeating itself over and over and over again? That's because, again, in cutscene, this is always true. It's still always 1 because we can't shut it down yet. We can't shut down Henry.start because we need it to continue to run, but we don't want this loop to keep going, right? So what do? We want to now change this also to trigger once. Okay. Now, let's copy this and let's move on to the next one here. And let's make our condition that dialogue count is equal to 2. And what do we want to say here? This time I want it to be Bob speaking, and Bob is going to sigh and then say no. Okay, we can keep the rest of this here still, right? Now we need a way to actually update our dialogue count. So let's create another section here. And I want it to be equal to the rest of these on the same plane here. And this is going to be move dialogue exchange along. Might move it along. Let's add another sub-event here. And I want to try to keep our game mostly using just 2 buttons, spacebar and return key in terms of actions. The arrow keys we can talk about another time. That's easy enough to change. But let's do keyboard, key released, and we're going to do the return key here. And we're going to say when the return key is released and we're in the middle of a cutscene, so let's once again add gmanager.cutscene start is equal to 1. We're in the middle of a cutscene here. We just want to update dialogue count, right, and add 1. Do +1, right? Now, at the same token, remember, on type on dialogue, we use a return key here as well, and we don't have anything indicating whether or not there's a cutscene going on. Well, I want to use the other return key for when there's a cutscene. So I've got to add here variable, global variable, value of a global variable, gmanager.cutscene start needs to be equal to 0, meaning we're not in a cutscene here. All right. Let's run this and let's see how that works. Okay. Let's hit the return key. There's Bob. All right, good. So, we moved through the dialogue here, but it was a bit laborious, and dealing with this timer issue here and the constant looping as well, because we can't shut down .start yet, makes it difficult to test well, okay? Using these trigger once conditions helps quite a bit because we only need to trigger these 1 time when it's true. The nice thing is, for future text dialogue exchanges, we can just use this pattern. But I'm going to stop there for this tutorial because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to creating another timer, all right, to really give our cutscene some some life to it.